Surprise, I lied. This is actually about an episode of The Simpsons featuring Lego. Brick Like Me is a very unusual episode of The Simpsons in that it features many things The Simpsons is not known for, including emotional development of the characters. In a nutshell, thematically, Homer finally learns about the joy of spending time with his daughter, just in time for his daughter to grow up into a preteen/teenager and no longer want to spend as much time with him. A cruel tragedy. So he hallucinates this fantasy brick world he built with Lisa and sort of goes into a coma and spends all his time there so that way Lisa can never grow up. The show is very on the nose about this though, like everything I just told you, it explains explicitly. I have not said anything so far that does not directly come out of the characters' mouths. They tell you all of the themes and everything happening in the story and why it has emotional significance. I'm a big fan of that, and the emotional parts come together all right, so does the theme, but the pacing's kind of fucked up. They had a really, really cool idea where after Homer realizes he's in a fantasy world, he decides he wants to stay there because he likes it there. He even brings up a point regarding the Matrix that I often think is accurate in that if the Matrix were a real thing, most people would probably prefer to stay in the Matrix. Yes, we often say we would prefer to experience reality instead of a fantasy world, but in that situation, I think most people would prefer to stay in the Matrix, ultimately. So he embraces that everything is a fantasy and decides to roll with it because it's his ideal world, and this lasts for all of like 5 fucking seconds. Almost immediately after he decides he likes it in the fantasy world, he goes home to play with Lisa, and then in a span of like 10 seconds decides he doesn't like it anymore and changes his mind. And it's not really a cool reason he stops liking the fantasy world, it's just really inane stuff he starts listing off for no particular reason, like, oh, Bart's never gonna leave the house, or I'll never get to die, both things that are not an issue when you live in a fantasy world where everything is the way you want to make it. And in other episodes of The Simpsons, it's shown very much that Homer does not, want to die someday, but this character he has in this special is different from every other episode of The Simpsons for the better, so whatever. He says that he doesn't want to work for Mr. Burns forever, that he doesn't want Bart to stay in the house forever, and that he wants to die someday, but all of these things are things he can have in his fantasy world. It's established that nothing bad can ever happen in Homer's fantasy world. There's a scene where he chucks something at a police helicopter, the police helicopter explodes, and instead of him getting arrested, they just put it in a Tupperware box and say they'll rebuild it tomorrow, no harm done. So if he decided to quit working for Mr. Burns, or just decided to do his job even more poorly than usual, there would be no repercussion. And this version of Homer is not as stupid as usual, so he has to know that living in a fantasy world doesn't make him immortal. He will still die someday, he just will not be as consciously aware of his incoming death. And if the list of reasons Homer gave sounds stupid to you too, apparently the writers agree because Homer spontaneously changes his reasoning. He tells Marge that he needs Lisa to grow up because the fact that children grow up is what makes spending time with them special, which sure, that's a valid sentiment if you want to feel that way, but then where did all the other shit come from? And how and why did Homer suddenly reach an epiphany that contradicts everything he believed and felt previously without any sort of inciting event? It's a shame because the pacing in the rest of the episode is really good, like there's a minor subplot where you learn that Bart's creativity is being stifled, and it's his creativity that ultimately helps Homer reach his original reality. So they found a reasonable way to include character development and foreshadowing for the final confrontation of the episode, but not for the most important part where Homer reaches the conclusion that he would like to return to his real world. And as a result, it just kind of sucks because people don't work that way. People don't suddenly on a whim change one of their most deeply held and personal beliefs, a belief so deeply held it makes them create an entire comatose alternate reality, mind you. And in case you think I'm playing up the bad pacing way more than it should be, here is the entire scene where Homer changes his mind about wanting to live in a fantasy world.
Stay shiny and wonderful, just the way I want it. You'll always be my little girl. Maggie will always be my giant baby. Bart will never move out of the house. I'll work for Mr. Burns forever. Marge and I will never grow old together and live like fat cats on Social Security. Good Lord! I'll never experience the ultimate reward for a life well lived. The gentle slumber of death.
Man, what a fucking joke of a payoff for such a really cool concept in an otherwise incredibly well-paced episode. At least the characters in this episode are actually, like, not shitty. So, that's pretty good.